This is episode 273 of the Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts podcast. This episode is titled An Appraisal of Splinters. And don't forget, we've got hundreds of past episodes on all kinds of topics for you to listen to from Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts for free. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts. I'm your host, Jennifer Crittenden. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by Discreet Guide, the training company for improving your speaking and writing skills. Thank you for joining us, and tune in on Mondays for new episodes. I'm delighted to have a returning guest today. So John Julius Reel is with us. So welcome to the show again, John.
It's a pleasure to be back with you. We had so much fun the first time. Why not do it again, right?
Exactly. Yes. And today we're going to be talking about a memoir called Splinters, which just came out. It's brand new. It's by Leslie Jamison. But first, I want to talk just a little bit about John so you all remember who he is. So he was on the show for episode 252, in case you want to go back and listen to that one. It was a very good episode, in my humble opinion. And it was about his memoir, which is called My Half Orange, A Story of Love and Language in Seville, a lot of which was about language, which was really cool for us to talk about, but also about his becoming a father, which is appropriate for the book that we're going to be talking about today, Splinters, which is about Leslie becoming a mom, and particularly a single mom. Let me tell you a little bit more about John, though. He moved from Staten Island to Seville in 2005, and I especially want to mention that his YouTube channel, Book Rants, is one in which he covers memoirs extensively. And that will help us a lot today because it turns out, don't read that many memoirs as I was looking at my bookshelf. It's just not a genre, apparently, that I focus on a lot. So I'm really grateful to John for being with us today to talk about Splinters. And a little bit more information about John. He's a regular participant on Andalusian Public Radio. He's dabbled in acting, and he's published over 100 articles in Spanish newspapers. He also teaches English and loves teaching. And his Facebook page, Spanglish in a Minute, and his Instagram account have over 200,000 combined followers. And My Half Orange was his first book in English. All right. So, John, you and I talked a lot about memoir on that episode 252. And so it's really appropriate for us to be talking about Splinters, another kind of love story today. But I want to warn the listeners, we'll see how we navigate this, but I want to warn the listeners that John did contact me partway through reading Splinters and saying, I don't like this book that much. Are you going to really make me finish it? And so I said, I'm having some second thoughts myself. This memoir is not something that I would necessarily wholeheartedly recommend to people. And so let's see how we go, right? Can we make this an interesting conversation about a book that we didn't necessarily love? So, John, tell me what your concerns were about Splinters as you were there partway through the book.
Well, I think I wouldn't be quite as kind as you in saying I didn't necessarily love it. I don't know. It was tough going for me, and I kept wanting to check myself because, I think there's a tendency on like Amazon and Goodreads where people will review books, or they won't review books, they'll review the author. They'll say, I didn't like this person. They'll judge the author's behavior in the book. So it's almost as though, it's interesting, right? I thought a lot about this. It's almost as though she writes this book in such a way that you can't judge the book without also judging her, almost as though she has applied her literary skills to a kind of emotional dump about, I don't know, first her divorce, and then I guess raising her child from the marriage alone by choice, And then at the same time, balancing that with her career, she's quite a successful writer. I mean, I don't know, I mean, she's been a New York Times bestseller for her first books, and her second book, I think, was a collection of essays that made it to the New York Times bestseller list.
Yeah, let me jump in here with that because, yeah, our listeners should be aware of that Leslie Jamison is actually becoming quite renowned with her books. So this is her third book, at least. She's the author of, as John says, 2 New York Times bestsellers. One is called The Recovering, and that was her memoir about her alcoholism. And I think she also talks about suffering from anorexia in that book. So you already get a little bit of a feel for the kind of memoir that she writes. Gary Greenberg, who's a psychotherapist, wrote for the New Yorker about that book that Jamison was concerned from the outset that her book would not escape. And I'm going to quote here, the tedious architecture and tawdry self-congratulation of a redemption story. And then in Gary's words, that it would in fact be boring. And so Gary goes on to say, she needn't have worried, such is her command of metaphor and assonance, that she could rivet a reader with a treatise on toast. We perhaps have no writer better on the subject of psychic suffering and its consolations. Then her other bestseller, which is kind of surprising to me, was a collection of essays called The Empathy Exams. Listen, she has all the credentials. She has a AB from Harvard, an MFA from Iowa Writers Workshop, and a PhD from Yale. And I should also mention that the advanced reader copy that I received has a list in the back of the marketing and promotion campaign that they designed for this book. And it is enough to make an author drool. I mean, it is a whole litany of the advertising campaign, the author tour, the promotional videos, the outreach, the libraries, the Edelweiss things, the NetGalley promotion. I mean, it's really incredible, all the things that they did for this book, which just goes to show how much they were willing to invest in this book. And the blurbs for this book are totally astonishing. I mean, the book is just covered with just these rave reviews, similar to Greenberg's thing. So, yeah, I should say that at the outset. Leslie is certainly very highly credentialed, and she's in it. She's in this inner circle of literary people who, to some extent operate inside a bubble, the New Yorker and so on and so forth. Then the question is, does the average reader like this book? And so then I'll turn it back to John, where we can talk about, as average readers, what we thought.
I don't know. I mean, it's unfair to judge a writer by just one book, and I haven't read her other stuff. Also, I read that this memoir was kind of composed by sort of pulling together or tying together a bunch of personal essays. And I've seen that fail before.
Oh.
Okay. So, maybe some of the material that we've read in the book would work better in essays. Maybe, it's the material that tied all this together. She wanted to try to find some sort of theme to link all of this stuff. But again, as you say, the reviews are just rave. I don't know if those reviews are for this book. I got the sense that they were. And I mean, I just don't believe the writers are telling the truth. I just think that, it's a kind of, you pat my back, I'll pat yours. It's this is the thing. I mean, I have a problem with a book like this because I feel as though there are readers who might read this book for the first time and consider this is what memoir is like.
Oh.
I mean, I just don't believe that it's like this. I mean, you hear the reviews about it being kind of brave.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, one thing is, or like raw. I mean, one thing is raw. It's not really raw. I'd say it's more like exhibitionist.
Oh.
And more than kind of brave, it seems almost desperate. There's a sense of her being out of control. At one point, she describes her, I don't know, it's manic.
Yeah.
I guess the thing is, it can be described as a kind of style in the sense that, this sense of like writing in real time about what is going on in her life, which I don't feel is anything special. I don't feel as though there's anything going on in her life that is especially noteworthy. Now, writers can turn
Mm-hmm.
the mundane into something exceptional with style. But I just don't get the sense that there's anything in this story that there's nothing redeeming. She doesn't redeem her life. She doesn't redeem this kind of mess that her life is. I mean, maybe you could read this if you're in a similar situation and you can identify with a life that seems to be at loose ends. And you might feel as though, okay, I can relate to this particular character who is still working through stuff. I don't think the book resolves anything. I mean, it's funny. Did I enjoy this book? I kind of enjoyed it almost in the sense of like a kind of anthropological study in like the way certain people live. I mean, it might be a kind of stamp or a type of, what would be the word? A kind of character study of a certain type of person that does exist. I mean, this living almost hysterically with tremendous sense of self-absorption, of self-importance, but also self-aware of her self-importance. Mm-hmm. She kind of is grandstanding with her guilt trips. There's something in the book that it makes me feel like the way that I wonder, it'd be great to hear your position. What did you feel about the way that she portrayed her ex, for example?
Yeah, you've made such interesting points. And that's right. There is kind of a display character to it. And I think the X is a perfect example of that, where for me, at least, I actually got to feel kind of sorry for that guy. And one of the Amazon reviewers who, some of them had very different opinions from the famous people who were blurbing the book. And one of them said at some point, he said the X comes off as more sympathetic than she does, which seems like a really strange outcome from a memoir, but maybe that's strategic, right? Maybe that was, as you say, maybe that was something that she was kind of going for. But yeah, the X, I mean,
I think it's C, by the way, right? It's C.
Yes, that's C. And it's known who he is. I didn't know him. He's also a writer.
Yeah, this is another thing about the thing. It's like, I knew who it was immediately upon reading the book. It's Charles Bach. Okay. And Charles Bach has written two excellent novels, one of which is called Beautiful Children, which made, a big splash when it came out. She got a first front page review and feature done in the New York Times. It's a wonderful book. It's about this child who runs away in Las Vegas. And then he wrote a second book called, I think, Alice and Oliver, which is, I've read them both. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of fictional account of the real life experience of him losing his first wife by cancer while they had a young child. And both are tremendous works of literature. Tough going, not easy reads. But she portrays him. There are scenes that seemed almost icky to read. I felt as though, this is the father of her daughter that she's portraying in this way. I feel as though in any particular relationship, even good relationships, even the relationship that I have, for example, with my wife, thank God I'm happily married to her. But if she took 2 or 3 things that I said, and she put them in a book, okay, I would look like the worst villain in the world.
Right? Good to know.
Right? Yeah, now you know my dark side. But she kind of puts these scenes where he kind of uses, he calls her an anorexic bitch, or I think there's a line where he says, he uses obscenities with her. He spits at one particular point, I'll say whatever I fucking want to you. He uses this kind of language, and I'm wondering, like, what is the reason for doing this? Is she trying to justify why she left him? You get the sense in the beginning of the book that she kind of closed him off. I mean, you can't really know the story. All we can do is, I guess, suspect what's going on. But I felt as though she's portraying this guy in a way which she has every right to do if she wants to do that. I mean, that's what she wants to do. But I felt it was icky. I felt like it was unfair. I felt like it gave no voice to him. It's funny, he's coming out with a memoir that's coming out in October of this year called
great. Dueling memoirs.
Right? That's what I'm wondering, because if I do review this, I will do it in cahoots with his book. Check out this title: I Will Do Better, a father's memoir of heartbreak, parenting, and love. Now, who knows if this is going to touch on his first relationship, which he had a daughter by the first wife, and he also had a daughter by the second wife.
Right.
And I've had dealings with Charles Bach. He's a sweet guy. I feel as though the way he's portrayed as this kind of tough guy with tattoos, I feel as almost that doesn't seem to ring true as who he is. I don't know. I just felt when I read it that I felt like it was a cheap shot a bit at him. I don't know. I mean, but again, I wanted to ask your opinion because you're a woman. I mean, is it unfair of me to say that I felt it was an unfair and icky portrayal of him, especially in the way that she described his kind of violence of language? What did you think about that?
I certainly don't think it's unfair for you to pass judgment on that, right? I'm not of the camp where, you're a man, so you can't comment on that. I think all of us get to comment on everything. Of course, convenient for me to be able to say that, but that is my feeling. I mean, I do think you're wise to ask input from other people, right? Maybe a woman would have a different perspective. She talks a lot about his anger, right? And even in places in the book, she acknowledges he didn't hit her. He wasn't abusive. Right. He didn't neglect the baby. I mean, there are a lot of things he didn't do, right? Of course, not doing things doesn't necessarily make you a wonderful person. But she seems to recognize that for all the things that we normally look at for, wow, that was a bad guy, he didn't do any of those things. But she does come back to his anger a lot. I do get the feeling. Yeah. And I get the feeling for her that seems to be a really big deal, right? She talks a lot about being a people pleaser and that she's sort of easily cowed, which you wouldn't think with her credentials would be the case. I mean, obviously they weren't suited for each other. And so maybe his anger was something that was really frightening to her. And, ultimately did lead to the breakup of the marriage. But for those of us who live in the real world, who are often dealing with men who behave extremely differently from her ex, it's easy for us to kind of minimize that. I think whenever we're faced with a marriage that failed, I sort of throw up my hands. I mean, it's really hard for people to get along for decades, right? I mean, you have a happy marriage and I have a happy marriage, but I think we're kind of exceptions, right? It doesn't seem like a lot of marriages last that long. And it's just hard for people to get along, right? I think it's perfectly fine for you to pass judgment on her criticisms of her husband.
But just the way that she kind of portrays it. I mean, this is a work of literature. Right? You kind of want to get a sense that there are going to be characters besides her that are going to be well-rounded. You don't get a sense that Charles Bach or C is well-rounded. She tries, she gives a bit of the relationship at the beginning when they fell in love. Okay. But as far as the breakup and how it occurred, here we are kind of trying to understand what's going on or what went on to cause the breakup. But I think that's because she did not give us a kind of any satisfying sense of what went on there. There's no insight into relationships that's really given here. You get insights into the fact that she does seem to me to be, in many places, to be an infuriating type of person. At one point, she, I think, gives his criticism of her, saying that she kind of is, I think he called her has a tendency toward virtue signaling to make people think that she was generous. I mean, I'm not giving it word for word, but my problem with the book is that nothing is given its due, except everything is kind of brushed over. There's nothing really profound in the book. She has passion. She's a passionate person, but it's a superficial passion. You get the sense that she's caught up in a kind of the new man. One man she calls tumbleweed, and another man she calls the philosopher. She has these kind of ironic terms for men. You never get a sense of who they really are. There's a kind of superiority in her tone about them. There are some funny lines. I think there's one line she describes this man friend she's got as being, always with animals, or you get the sense he's both like her. She's kind of very performative. Everything he does seems to be out there to, for example, like, she can't do anything without apologizing. Like there's a point where she's in, I don't know, Capri or something like that. She's left her daughter either with her mother or with somebody, and she's gone on this, I don't know, she's going to give a talk at some literary festival, and she starts smoking again. And so she's apologizing for smoking to the reader, that she's only doing, like, there's always something. She can't do anything without trying to somehow qualify it to show that she's still a good mother. And it's almost, to me, it was kind of insufferable the way she'll say, for example, at one hand, she'll say, she describes her mother as being this woman who went away and left her at one point to do something. Her mother's an academic and went away to do this project in Africa and left her alone for a month. And she kind of applauds her mother for being able to give the example of somebody who can do her thing without damaging her daughter, right? And then she'll go on and she'll beat herself up for like leaving her daughter for a little while. It's kind of like it's filled with contradictions. And of course, human beings are filled with contradictions. And I mean, but there's no art in it. There's no art in the way that she describes her contradictions. You get the sense, as much as she sort of portrays herself as being self-aware and tries to criticize herself before others can criticize her, you get the sense that nothing is said with authority. Nothing is said with authenticity. There's never a sense where I feel as though I can trust her sentiments or feelings. It's as though that she's constantly trying to put defenses up. I felt like it was a very insincere book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I knew we would have a fascinating conversation about this, but yeah, you've brought up some things that never occurred to me. One thing I did want to say, I mean, the book is called Splinters.
Yes.
And my interpretation of that title is that it's bits and pieces, sort of glowing, hot, stabbing you in your psyche with passion, right? But also, the way the book is structured, to your point, I think I also wasn't very comfortable with. To me, it reads like a first draft, if even a first draft. To me, it reads more like a collection of things that you intend one day to put into a book. And so this thing you're describing about no art, no arc, not filled out characters, I mean, to me, those are all characteristics of a first draft or just notes for a book. And
I agree.
Yeah, so I wonder if that's part of the problem, is that what we're looking at is something that is pretty raw, pretty undeveloped, and maybe not very well considered either, to your point. But I agree, she flashes from moments of, look at what a terrible person I am, to, well, this is how I feel. I gave birth to that baby, and so this is just how I feel, and that's okay. Which is a tone or an attitude that I do observe in memoirs these days. Since you read a lot of memoirs, I wanted to ask you about that, because this notion of memoirs as being a place where you explain how you feel, and that the fact that you feel it justifies the feeling of it. I feel as though this is a theme that I'm seeing a lot in memoirs. This sort of, I guess you could call it entitled, although that word has so many. It's a lack of judgment or it's a lack of filter, maybe, on
Yeah.
yourself. Yeah. So are you seeing this a lot in memoirs? What's this all about?
Well, I think perhaps it is a trend in memoir. It came out, I mean, the first memoir I read like it, which was better than this one, was a memoir that's been, I mean, hailed as a masterpiece. I don't think it is, but it's called Educated by Tara
Yes.
Westover.
Hmm.
Okay. And this was a book about sort of growing up off the grid, I think in Idaho or I don't know, I can't remember. It's somewhere in the Midwest. And she was raised in this kind of among religious fanatics, close to a cult, and how she kind of like rose out of this world, this abusive world. Her brother's abusive, her father's abusive, and but you never get the sense, for example, in that book, that she ever did anything wrong. I mean, everyone around her is doing things wrong,
Hmm.
but she's never done anything wrong. Now, that may be the case. I think perhaps that was a situation where it's a tough thing to pull out of, and she did pull out of it, and she did triumph in many ways, but it's a kind of Horatio Alger type of story in the sense that it's simplified. It's like everything's against her, yet she
Hmm.
rises up out of it. It's
Hmm.
a kind of simplified story, and I could see how that would move people, just like Horatio Alger stories moved readers of a certain generation. But it's
Hmm.
not a story that's well-rounded.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, this story, the story Splinters, attempts to be more intellectual. I mean, I think she's considered to be a critic. I mean, there are moments in this book where she kind of shifts into this off the cuff criticism, which very rarely convinces me in the book. It doesn't seem to be well considered or profound. And so it has this sense of her constantly recognizing her privilege
Hmm.
and at the same time almost hyper aware of her privilege, but at the same time not. Like there's a scene where she kind of singles out this faculty member for not allowing him to give her his office so that she can breast pump. And so if you read this paragraph, she sort of talks about her privilege, that she has even the privilege to ask this. But at the same time, the way this guy reacts is sort of a little bit, he's taken aback by what she says. Now, you can't even tell if this is something that she's imagining or if it's real. And I think she actually puts that in. But nonetheless, it comes across, or he comes across, as someone who is not understanding of her, right? You get the sense of her feeling like, poor me, I can't. This professional mom who's trying to be the perfect mother and trying to be the perfect teacher and trying to be the perfect writer, and this divorced mother who can't have a moment alone to, pump her breast so that her child can be well raised, and how terrible of this man to not see her point of view. It just comes across. And this is the typical thing about the book. It's like, yeah, you can understand why she needs or wants to pump her breast at a particular time, but it just comes across as insufferable. There's something about it that comes across as icky, like unfair, at the same time as, understandable. I couldn't really, I got frustrated. I was
Yeah.
annoyed by her at that, more annoyed by her than I was by him. I just have to say it. But again, you know, mm, I feel like if she were listening to this right now, she would point me out as a typical man, and my response is a typical male response. That's how I feel when I read that book. I feel as though there's another line where I think I'm jumping all over the place, Jennifer. Forgive me, but everything's coming into my head. But there's another line where you pointed out a criticism, some critic earlier, and she quotes a critic as saying her writing is almost like pushing past shame to shamelessness. Again, I don't know the exact quote, but she
Oh.
kind of mocks, or there's a kind of sense of superiority in the way that she kind of, this typical male response. I think she talked to him as an older male, older white male says this. So she's immediately, the way she describes him before the line or after the line kind of diminishes the importance of what he's saying. And I remember reading and thinking, that is exactly what it is. Although I think the line was meant in a complimentary way.
Uh-huh.
I think the book in many ways is kind of shameless. But again,
Mm-hmm.
is that something? Is that a style? Is she going to make an excuse that I wanted to write this splintered narrative? It was my on purpose that I wasn't tying things together. I mean, it's like the old story, like you don't get it. That's why it's not good. I mean, is that,
Uh-huh.
you know what I mean? Like, do we not get it? Or is it just not good? You know, I mean,
Right.
I threw out a bunch of stuff there.
No, that's a great question because although there were definitely critical Amazon reviews, I'll mention a couple here. One person wrote that it was a very annoying memoir. I hadn't thought of the word insufferable, but yeah, that one's pretty, yeah, harsh. You know, self-indulgent, self-obsessed. People say I couldn't finish it. It was utterly mundane. And then one person said if this book had been written by someone without Miss Jamison's track record, it wouldn't have been published and it wouldn't be read if it had, which of course
Not in a million years.
it opens up a whole other can of worms. But then this person says, you know, it's boring. Miss Jamison should be happy that what she considers traumatic and dramatic isn't, and that her life is just fine. Another person wrote, you know, new heights of self-absorption. Yeah, there's another one says, what is the purpose of this memoir? Nasty self-displays of nastiness so the reader can feel superior. So that is really interesting that like, why are people reading this? Because there are many, many more positive Amazon reviews of this book than critical reviews.
Yes, there are.
I mean, most of us are cowed by this kind of thing. It's like, well, you know, look at all these blurbs. Everybody else loved it. I'm not going to go post a negative Amazon review, right? So we do get intimidated by this kind of force of positive praise for something. And so we ask ourselves, do we just not get it? Is something wrong with us? But I think you're onto something about why people are drawn to this and what there is, whether it's, sometimes I think it's voyeurism, right? Like sometimes these memoirs that are about really bad alcoholic behavior, like do people read that? It was like, oh, let's see what otherwise normal person got into a terrible situation in their life. So there's sort of that, right? There's kind of this voyeurism. And if this had been published with a completely different, really tawdry cover and promoted in a different way, I can imagine it being that kind of sort of classless Jerry Springer kind of, you know, yeah, this is, yeah, you know,
it's
right?
cheap. It's got a cheap
parts
feel.
of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you could imagine that. But then there's this other kind of memoir that people seem really drawn to, and that is this woe is me kind of memoir where
Yeah.
like educated, right? Look what happened to me. And then that's sort of the whole refrain throughout the whole book.
Sure.
So, yeah, so I think this book does walk that line. And some of the woe is me, to your point, I think does rest on some assumptions that her reader will be sympathetic to a single mom
Yes.
and already be sort of prepared for objecting to men's behavior,
Yes.
whether it's the ex or whether it's the guy that she shared an office with. It's interesting that you picked that one out because that is the one, John, that kind of got my goat. Because
Really?
because he says fine. He
I
says,
know.
okay, you can use the office, which, you know, in his shoes, I'm not sure I would have been quite so quick to say that. You know,
Sure.
it's like, where am I supposed to go? Right. But yeah, although he agreed, she didn't like the way in which he agreed.
Right. He didn't
It's
jump
like,
to agree. Yeah.
it's
He
like,
didn't jump
wow,
to agree. You know,
man, we really got to be better here. You know,
yeah. When I say insufferable, there's a kind of sense of the way she judges other and the way she judges herself. I mean, there's a sense of people who beat themselves up all the time. There's a tremendous arrogance in that type of person. I mean, you know, I at one time was like that. I sort of imagine myself as kind of like heroically flawed, right? There's a kind of sense of, and I mean, this is, I got over myself.
Oh.
I mean, look, she's 35, 36 when she wrote this. So she's 20 years younger than I am. Okay. So, when I was 36 years old, I had not gotten over myself. I thought my flaws were heroic. So it's possible that, there are people, and maybe if I were 36 or 35 years old and in similar circumstances, I would find the book relatable. I mean, perhaps I've aged out of this book. It's possible. I mean, that's totally possible. But yeah, the whole idea of voyeurism and how she kind of, like I said, I think I used the word exhibitionist. Well, exhibitionists are perfect for voyeurs. It's almost like a perfect marriage between
right.
the type of reader who might want to sort of peek into this messy, unresolved life that really doesn't move anywhere. I mean, you never get the sense in this book that progress is being made. I mean, changes are happening. Okay. But
time is passing.
Time is passing. Events are changing. The guys are changing. The guys that she's
the guys
with,
are changing. Exactly.
Right? And then, it ends in this note where she sort of goes to this couple, this lesbian couple, and feels at peace with her daughter. And, the thing is, it's like there are lines in the book where she describes this teacher aspect to the book, where she describes like how she teaches students and details she gives them on how they have to include details. She goes through the motions of being a writer. She'll put in little details that sort of smack of, she has skill. Obviously she has skill, but I think you're right in the sense that it's like a first draft. And I also want to say that there are some books. Let me give you an example. There are two books that I've read, not written in this particular time, but relatively recently published. One by a writer named Benin called Days in the Caucasus. Although this book was written in 1945, I think, in Paris, it was only recently translated to English, I think, in 2018 by a press called Pushkin Press. And this woman's life was just unbelievable. I mean, she went from being the most privileged, rich person in Baku, Azerbaijan, to being this poor, down and out person living in Paris. And all the things she went through during the Russian Revolution, she went through hell. I mean, her father was put in prison. But the way that it was written, there's no woe is me. It's just sort of like she's pushing through. This is a fascinating insight into a particular time, into a particular mentality, into her kind of immaturity at that time. She's aware of her immaturity. And then to give another example of a novel or a memoir written more recently that is a sort of tough story is, for example, The Boy Kings of Texas, written by a writer named Domingo Martinez, but growing up on the border of Texas in this kind of like clan of Mexican immigrants, families, and so forth. What a life he lived. I mean, a horror story. And, drunks, abuse, but you never get the sense that he is full of himself. You get the sense of him sort of like pushing through this situation. There's something about the tone, Jennifer, that, and again, how do we articulate what's art? How do we, I mean, you could write the same story about the same situation that Domingo Martinez did, and it doesn't come across as art. It could come across as woe is me, but it doesn't, because there's some sense of him having assimilated the story, of having sat on it or with it long enough to turn it into art. And you don't get the sense that Leslie Jamison has done that. It seems very, very much scattered. There seems to be no elevating line running through it. It is not elevated. The story's not elevated to art. It's just, as I said, an emotional dump that she applied her literary skills to in a way that doesn't really, it almost makes it tougher to read. I don't know, because you get the sense that she thinks it's a finished product, But again, maybe it is something. I think you said to me earlier that you suspected that it might be to fulfill a contract.
It crossed my mind just because I know that sometimes happens. Now, I feel that way less now that I see that she's written another memoir, although maybe that's part of the problem, right? She's starting to be pigeonholed into writing these kind of voyeuristic, let me open the kimono and show you just what a terrible person I am. As you're talking, I'm actually starting to feel a little bit sorry for Leslie because
Yeah.
I think you're right that these glowing reviews, I suspect, on Amazon are written by younger people, and the critical reviews, I think, are written by older people. And I
Yeah.
think age is one of those things that does give you perspective on where your woes fit in the context of other people's woes. Because I think when you're young, you don't have that realization that this is normal. Teenagers fall in love, right? You
Mm.
just don't have that kind of, stepping back and seeing the big picture. I did want to mention a couple of these really positive, glowing Amazon reviews. And one of them, I think, is the top review on Amazon. I don't know if it's a man or a woman, wrote, "I love this book. It simply spills into you like the author is pouring it directly into your bones and brain and soul, sentence by sentence, each splinter, red hot, glowing, precise, blah, blah, blah." The language that this reviewer is using is also fairly poetic or arty kind of, and
Mm.
finishes, "This is a special book." But I think you're really onto something that for a certain kind of reader, maybe a younger kind of reader, they do relate to this. But of course, also, they might be very enamored of Leslie. And as I said, I started feeling a little bit sorry for her if she's been encouraged down this path by fans,
Mm.
by her publisher, by her agent. This is like more, they're like pushing her more, more. Show us
Yeah.
how terrible you are. And that, because she's living in this bubble of this, high class literary people, that she's been encouraged to do something that really isn't very noble at the end. And, I remember you mentioning that you nearly published a book that your father read and suggested, maybe don't publish that. And maybe
Yeah.
it would have been good for Leslie to have a dad who would say to her,
Mm.
this isn't so great. Maybe put this aside for a decade and think about it.
Well, it's funny. In some of my book rants reviews, I have sort of ranted against editors who I think should take better care of their writers.
Mm,
I feel as though these people who are reviewing her book positively, who are giving her the impression that she's creating important work, I just feel as they're doing her a great disservice. Because I feel, for example, Mary Carr. I mean, Mary Carr wrote a wonderful memoir. She wrote The Liars Club and some other memoirs.
mhm.
I mean, I'm sure she considers Leslie Jamison a friend, and perhaps I know they've both overcome alcoholism together, so perhaps they feel a kind of bond, and they can't really they're not she's not somebody that's going to criticize her friend's work and so on and so forth. So, and I can understand that. That's noble. I wouldn't expect my friend to want to come out and, come out against me. But, I think before a book like this gets published, perhaps you could say to him, is this something that you want to publish? I mean, do you know that your daughter one day will read this? That your daughter one day will read this about her father? That your daughter one day will read this about you? I don't think she is aware. I mean, I feel sorry for her in a way that, like, look, I was lucky to have a father who told me when I wrote this book that, John, he said to me, this might get published, but, I think you'll always regret it. He shocked me into the realization that, just because something might be publishable or something might be liked or read, is this something that you can live with, or that you will want to live with? I mean, these are harsh words, and I feel kind of bad about saying them, but I do feel as though the literary industry should take better care of their writers. They should say, look out for yourself. You're a tremendous talent. And look, she is a tremendous talent. There are parts in the book where you get the sense that you're taught. Look, she's got a degree from the Iowa's Writers Workshop. I think she's got a PhD. She's a Harvard grad, right? This is not someone who's stupid. This is not, I mean, I'm sure she's written some wonderful essays. Maybe if I read these essays, the thing is, I am not motivated to read anything else she wrote after reading this book. I just won't dip into that anymore, which I think is something that writers should take care to consider, because, there's so much out there to read. I mean,
Yeah.
I finished this book because I was looking forward to an interesting discussion with you. And also, she's tremendously charming. I mean, I've seen her in a literary podcast with the other people
Oh,
podcast with Brad Listy. Tremendously charming.
oh,
I mean,
interesting. Oh,
and
no, I didn't go look at anything. Oh, that's interesting to know. I
oh, she's
see.
very, very charming. And when Brad Listy sort of pushed her on her star, her literary star, which rose early and fast, she was very, very humble and very, very kind of articulate about that. She was very, very likable in the
I
podcast.
see.
And
Huh.
that was another reason why when you sent me this list of books that maybe we might talk about, I saw Splinters and I had just seen I've just seen the literary podcast. I thought, well, yeah, let me see this because Brad Listy also spoke positively about the book, but Brad Listy with the Other People podcast, I think he's now part of the establishment.
Uh-huh.
I think he probably, or I assume he kind of makes his money. Again, he's put in a lot of work. He's a very good interviewer. He reads the books of the writers that he's interviewing. I can't believe he liked this book. He gave the impression that he did.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I feel the need to sort of, I want to tell him, like, do you really like this book?
Mm-hmm.
You really like this book? Because his book, which is Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, is a wonderful memoir.
I see.
I mean, it's obvious. It's been 10 years. It took him 10 years to write. He's dealing with a lot of things. He's settled with it. Every line is sort of like crafted. I mean, how can a writer like that read a book like this and admire it? I just don't believe that he did admire it. I mean, maybe I am imposing my particular perspective on writers who are more or less my age, people who are more or less my age, who have a kind of deep literary sensibility. I just can't believe that they like this book. And I feel like those who are good readers and who pushed her to publish this book, they're doing her a disservice, in my opinion. I feel that strongly. I mean, the book left me with an icky sensation, a very icky sensation, as though I was seeing something I shouldn't be seeing.
Yeah.
Look, I love writers who are willing to be ugly and are willing to be raw. But again, something about their work takes it to another level. Something about their work and their voice and their attitude and their energy elevates it to the level of art. I just did not get the sense that that happened in this book at all.
Mm-hmm.
Am I being too harsh, Jennifer?
I mean, I always have that same feeling when you see some glowing review of a book that you think that was actually a pretty mediocre book, but you get, just these rave reviews, not even like,
Rave. Yeah.
oh, I recommend this book. It's like, this is the greatest book that ever found, God himself has, you're just
Oh.
like, really? But,
Mm.
I often do come back to this idea of there's no accounting for taste. I just have to acknowledge that there are many, many, many positive reviews of the book on Amazon. Those I think are genuine. And then probably a lot of these professional reviews are as well. So yeah, you do wonder. It's like, boy, I sure didn't read the same book, or I didn't see it the
Mm.
same way, right? I was going to challenge us to come up with things that we liked about the book. And as I went back through the book and read all my notes, I mean, my notes in the margins in some places are pretty harsh. I think there's more than one place where I wrote blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, yeah.
But there were a few.
I've got some too.
Yeah,
I've
there
got
were
some.
a few where I marked and when I went back through. So one of them, just for our listeners, in case you are interested in reading this book for these little moments of kind of fancy writing or, kind of
Right.
interesting original thought. Because sometimes she's kind of funny. Sometimes she's a little bit snarky, but I love
Yes.
snark when it's funny.
Mm-hmm.
But she has this one here. Actually, she's talking about recovering from being an alcoholic in this one. She said, recovery had taught me this. My gut wanted to drink and drink and drink. My gut didn't realize that no matter how much I drank, I'd still be thirsty. By the time I met C, I was sick of listening to my gut. I was ready to bring in upper management. Upper management said I was done with waffling, done with going back and forth. Upper management told me not to listen to my doubts. They were only coaxing me back into a prior version of myself. That was funny. I like this notion of inviting in upper management. I thought that was very funny.
I mean, she has her moments without a doubt. I mean, there's a line where she's talking about motherhood and she talks about the birth of her child and the miracle that it seems to her. She writes, how could a creature just suddenly exist when she had not existed, not like this at least, 2 days before? How could she just keep existing at every moment? It seems so improbable. I mean, that seemed to me like a relation or a feeling that I had also had. The miracle of the birth of a child. Or she writes in one place about heartbreak, heartbreak as something ongoing and hopeless and daily. I mean, she has at times the ability to, she nails it in places, but that's because she's very practiced and she's very gifted. You wonder what she would do if she had digested her material, how she would, like what if she had waited and she had written this book 10 years from now? She might have turned it into a masterpiece. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I doubt her talent. I don't doubt her talent. What I doubt is her judgment as far as choosing to publish this thing right now. I mean, there's another line here where she's here she is when she's talking about this guy that she describes as tumbleweed. And she says, it's all, looking at his Instagram feed, she says, it's all footage of him with his shirt off being kind to animals. I mean, she has a great wit about her. You get the sense that she can see through people. But I don't know. I mean, then there'll be other lines like, what is it where she writes about like she's always, my legs curling up beneath our legs as we talk. There's these kind of moments of like almost cringy, kind of like girly bonding moments of like with your cup of tea and sitting on the couch with your legs tucked under your rear ends and talking all night, which I think probably appeals to a certain type of reader. But to me, I'm like, God, it's just, I've read this so many times before, That
is part of it. It doesn't feel original. Those parts of it, yes, they don't feel original. And again, that might be a sign of youth, right? Where
maybe.
Maybe she just hasn't read that the rest of us are inundated with this kind of writing, but she may not be totally, aware of that. But you're right. There are other times where she does seem surprisingly observant and even, with a sort of remove from it. One of the ones that cracked me up was when she at one point in the book, she lives very close to the fire station.
Yeah.
And she was kidding about a divorcee burning candles. And she speculated that the fire station might have code vanilla, which is when they have when they have to burst into a place because some unhappy divorcee has started a fire with their candles, right? I mean, that's so funny and it's so good. It's such a good moment. There's another place, and in fact, I've been using this line where she says, this is the oldest you've ever been in your life. And that really struck with me. So I've been saying that to people until someone said to me, well, this is the youngest you're ever going to be again. It's like, oh, well, that's really clever.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're really onto something about this idea of it not being fully digested or it not being very well edited, or not reflected upon enough. So yeah, we'll put that out there to Leslie. Rewrite this book, do it again and publish it in 10 or 15 years, because I think you might have something very interesting then.
Yeah, because if you were going to edit this, it's not like you would take out certain parts. It's an entity.
I would take out a lot.
well, yeah. I mean, you'd almost say like just put it aside. I mean, like you can't really. It's not like if you took out certain parts, you could make it work.
I see what you mean. Right.
It's a kind of network of it all kind of fits together in this kind of undigested mass of, as I say for the third time, emotional dump. I mean, you don't get the sense. This is an undigested text, so it would have to be sat on. It would have to be assimilated before it could be done right. I mean, again, because she's clever, because she has all the skills, she can give it a kind of professional polish.
Yeah.
But that does not make it a good book.
And that's definitely what the publisher has done, right? It has all these hallmarks of something that's polished and finished. It just doesn't feel that way to us.
No, yeah, I agree. Yeah. I agree.
That was fascinating. I love our where we ended up with this book, because I think that's very fair where we concluded with it. Yes. So to our listeners, here's the challenge for you also to read this book and let us know what you think about it, if you think it stands on its own merits today, or if it might be better in another 10 or 15 years. So, John, thank you so much for the conversation. As
It's
always,
a pleasure.
it's delightful. Yeah, you bring up such interesting points. I really appreciate it. And before I let you go, is there anything you'd like to share with the audience about what you're up to these days?
Well, no, I mean, I would just, to add to your recommendation, I would love to hear readers say to me, maybe if you're going to go to Leslie Jamison's work, try one of her first 2 books or 3 books. I think she's finished a novel.
Mm-hmm.
2. I mean, it is unfair to judge a writer by 1 book. Mm-hmm. And this is her 4th book or maybe her 5th book. Oh, I don't know. But we don't have a kind of distance on her work. We don't know what it is. Her larger work is her oeuvre. We don't know it. Mm-hmm. So it might be that we caught her in a bad moment. Mm-hmm. So it may be that there are those other works that sort of got her this reputation. Maybe it's a deserving reputation. And I mean, again, I'm not stimulated to go back and check it out to see if she deserves her reputation. But I'd love it if other readers would
tell us,
check out those books and let us know. Well, John and Jennifer, check out this because this really shows her talent. This is Leslie Jamison at her best. I wonder what it would be like to read Leslie Jamison at her best, because I bet it's fantastic.
Yeah, maybe that book of essays, that alcoholism memoir doesn't draw me that much, but maybe the book of essays, it's just unusual for a book of essays to become a bestseller. So it must have been pretty good.
It must have been pretty good. And maybe those pieces were probably published in other media before. And maybe that's how she kind of cultivated a following, because she's got quite a following. She's got quite a following.
I see. Yeah, interesting. So, but wouldn't you like to mention book rants?
Oh, well, sure. As a hobby and as a book lover, I publish, I think I've got maybe 62 or 63 episodes where I review mostly memoir. Now I'm doing a new phase this year where I walk the streets of Seville, or I go to the parks, and I talk about one a contemporary book recently published, and I compare it to a classic. So, those are fun. I try to keep the videos to under 20 minutes. I've got 2 videos that are coming up. One about The Lover by Marguerite Duras, and a recently published book called Thirst for Salt. It got a tremendous push also by, the literary sort of establishment. I think that it's a great love story, but I think it ends very, very poorly. But I compared it to The Lover, and I'm also doing a review of, have you heard of Heresy Press?
No.
Heresy Press is a recent publishing house that I guess started in January of 2023, and it's looking to push back against what the author believes is kind of soft censorship, in the sense of certain books that are not being published because, I don't know, they're not politically correct, or and so I've read all the first 4 books that Heresy Press has published.
Oh, how interesting.
I am going to review the press rather than the books itself to see whether it lives up to its mission statement.
How interesting.
So, it was a lot of reading, over 1,000 pages, but worth it. And so that'll be coming out in about a month. So, I've got my projects, and there's my book, My Half Orange, which I'm going to continue to push. And I'm currently translating to Spanish because that's where most of my platform is. Hopefully I can translate it, have it looked over, and publish it here.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Yeah, I've got a lot of stuff on the table. And, I hope this is something that we do in the future again, Jennifer. This is fun because I have a great time talking to you always.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I always appreciate the support And yeah, thank you a lot for the work that you do with Book Rants. I think that's so great that you put energy into that, and they're so thoughtful and always interesting. Yeah, I highly recommend that to our listeners, and I'll put a link to that also in the show notes so they can find it. And thank you for your time
Oh, you're
today
welcome,
and
Jennifer.
for working through Splinters. Yeah, it's such a pleasure always to talk to you. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you for listening. Our goal in 2024 is to expand our audience because we get such great guests. So we'd love your help in spreading the word by sharing, subscribing, liking, thumbs upping, rating, and commenting. Got all that? Really, thanks for any support. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by Discreet Guide, the training company for improving your speaking and writing skills. Also, a shout out to Podomatic, our podcast hosting platform. You podcasters out there might want to check them out. They've been good to us. And finally, thanks to Quincas Morera for the theme music.